The history of human civilization is often told through the clamor of war, the ego of kings, and the written epics of gods. We know Egypt through the curses of the pharaohs. We know Mesopotamia through the lamentations of Gilgamesh. But there exists a cradle of civilization that rose in silence, a Bronze Age giant that spanned 1,000,000 square kilometers, yet left behind no deciphered name, no glorified conquerors, and no Rosetta Stone to unlock its secrets. This is the story of the Indus Valley Civilization. To understand the rise of the Indus Valley through myth is to engage in a unique historical detective story. Because they did not leave us a readable mythology, we must reconstruct their worldview, their mythos, through the mute testimony of fired brick, steatite seals, and the very layout of their cities. We must look at what they built to understand what they believed. The story begins not in the ancient past, but in the relatively recent colonial era. Until the early 20th century, the timeline of Indian history was truncated. Colonial historians, relying on the limits of available evidence, anchored the beginning of South Asian history to the invasion of Alexander the Great in 326 BC, or perhaps vaguely to the composition of the Vedas. There was a prevailing myth of the empty land, the idea that before the arrival of Indo-European speakers, the Indian subcontinent was inhabited only by primitive hunter-gatherers. This illusion was shattered in the 1920s. Two archaeologists, R.D. Banerjee and Daya Ramsani, working under the directorship of John Marshall, began excavating mounds of dust in the Punjab and Sindh provinces. In Harappa, locals had long spoken of a ruined city, utilizing its ancient, perfectly baked bricks to shore up their own homes and build the railway lines for the British Raj. They believed the bricks were the work of a god or a cursed city destroyed by divine wrath. In a sense, they were right about the destruction, if not the divinity. When the spade hit the soil at Mohenjo-Daro, literally the mound of the dead, it did not reveal a primitive settlement. It revealed a metropolis. The world was forced to rewrite the history of the Bronze Age. Suddenly, Egypt and Mesopotamia had appeared, a civilization vaster than both of them combined, possessing a sophistication of civil engineering that the world would not see again for thousands of years. To understand the myth of the Indus rise, we must first look to the geography that birthed it. Ancient civilizations are children of rivers. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Mesopotamia is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Indus civilization, too, was a hydraulic society. However, the historical consensus has evolved. While the Indus River was the spinal cord of this society, satellite imagery and hydroarchaeological surveys suggest a dual river system. To the east of the Indus flowed a massive river system, now largely dried up, known as the Gagar-Hakra. Many historians identify this dried riverbed with the Saraswati described in the Rig Veda, a mighty river that flowed from the mountains to the sea. This connection is the first intersection of geography and myth. If the Gagar-Hakra was indeed the Saraswati, then the rise of the Indus cities was supported by the most agriculturally fertile landscape on earth. The layout of settlements supports this. While Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro grasped the Indus, hundreds of smaller settlements clustered along the banks of the Gagar-Hakra. This was the Sapta Sindhu, the land of 7 rivers. The abundance of water created a specific cosmological outlook. Unlike the Tigris and Euphrates, which were prone to violent, unpredictable flooding that led the Mesopotamians to view their gods as chaotic and wrathful, the Indus and the Saraswati were generally more predictable. This geographical stability likely fostered a mythos of order. As we will see later in their urban planning, the Indus people did not seem to fear their environment. They mastered it. They did not build ziggurats to appease angry sky gods. They built water management systems to harness the earth's bounty. Their foundational myth was likely one of coexistence with water, treating it not just as a resource, but as a ritual element of purification. Civilizations do not spring fully formed from the earth. The rise of the Indus Valley has deep roots, stretching back to 7000 BC on the Kachi plain of Balochistan at a site called Mehrgarh. Mehrgarh is essential to dispelling the myth of foreign origin. Early 20th century theories, steeped in diffusionism, suggested that civilization was brought to the Indus from Mesopotamia. Mehrgarh proves otherwise. Here, we see the indigenous evolution of the Indus identity. In the earliest layers of Mehrgarh, we find a pre-ceramic society. They were transitioning from hunting to farming, domesticating wheat and barley and herding cattle sheep and goats. But even here in the Neolithic dawn, we find the seeds of the Indus ideology. Archaeologists have discovered graves at Mehrgarh that display a complex belief in the afterlife. Bodies were buried in flexed positions, often coated in red ochre, a substance universally associated with blood, life, and rebirth in prehistoric cultures. They were buried with ornaments, beads of lapis lazuli, turquoise, and seashells. The presence of seashells is particularly telling. Mehrgarh is hundreds of kilometers from the ocean. This implies that as early as 6,500 BC, there were trade networks connecting the mountains to the coast. This myth of the distant horizon, the cultural drive to seek materials from afar, would become a defining characteristic of the mature Harappan phase. Furthermore, Mehrgarh yields the precursors to the Indus pantheon. We find terracotta figurines of women with exaggerated hips and breasts. These are the earliest manifestations of the mother goddess cult. In a world where survival depended on the fertility of the soil and the herd, the female form became the totem of abundance. This was not merely art, it was a prayer in clay. As the millennia passed at Mehrgarh, we see a shift. The dentistry of the population shows they were eating softer, processed foods. The craftsmanship evolves. By 400 BCE, the distinct artistic style that would define the Indus Valley, the geometric motifs, the stylized animals, begins to appear on pottery. The myth was finding its visual language. Between 3300 BCE and 2600 BCE, the civilization underwent a rapid metamorphosis known as the early Harappan phase. This was a time of regionalization, where different cultures like the Khatdiji, Sothi-Siswal, and Omri-Aniel began to share common traits. One of the most intriguing aspects of this phase is the evidence of organized violence, or the lack thereof. At Khatdiji, we find a fortress wall and a layer of ash suggesting a massive fire. Whether this was accidental or the result of conflict is debated. However, what followed the fire was not chaos, but a sudden imposition of order. This brings us to the myth of unification. Unlike Egypt, which was unified by the sword of Narmer, or Mesopotamia, which was a patchwork of warring city-states, the Indus Valley seems to have been unified by ideology. Around 2600 BCE, a phenomenon occurred that archaeologists call the cultural integration. Across a vast area, pottery styles became uniform. Brick sizes were standardized to a strict 1:2:4 ratio. Weights and measures were harmonized with mathematical precision. How does a civilization achieve this without a visible military aristocracy? There are no grand palaces depicted in the ruins, no steels showing kings smiting enemies. The rise of the Indus Valley challenges the myth of the warrior king. It suggests a different kind of power structure, perhaps a hierarchy or a corporate rule by guilds and elites who utilized religion and trade as their primary tools of control. The myth that bound them was not the glory of a monarch, but the sanctity of structure. To be Harappan was to adhere to a specific way of life, a specific way of building, and a specific way of weighing goods. Order was their religion. As we approach the mature Harappan phase, 2600 to 1900 BC, we must grapple with the silence of their script. We have thousands of seals with short inscriptions, but the Indus script remains one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in history. Without texts, we cannot know the names of their gods. We do not know if they worshipped a sun god named Surya or a storm god named Indra. However, the absence of deciphered text does not mean an absence of narrative. The seals themselves are carriers of myth. They were used for trade, yes, stamped onto clay tags to secure bundles of goods, but the imagery chosen was specific and significant. The animals depicted, the bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, and the mythical unicorn, were not just decorative. They were likely totems of clans or representations of divine attributes. The rise of the Indus Valley was driven by the successful propagation of this shared symbolic language. A merchant from Latal in Gujarat could send a package to Harappa in the Punjab, and the seal would be recognized, respected, and understood. This implies a shared cultural mythos that transcended vast distances. As the villages of the early Harappan phase coalesced into the great cities, the shared ideology manifested in the physical world. The cities were not just places to live, they were cosmological diagrams. The orientation of the streets to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, suggests an astronomical awareness. The separation of the city into a raised upper town and a lower town implies a social or ritual hierarchy. The Indus people rose not by the sword, but by the brick. They conquered the chaotic floodplains of the Indus and the Saraswati through engineering and consensus. They built a civilization that prioritized hygiene, water access, and trade over monumental tombs. Around 2600 BCE, something extraordinary happened across the Indus floodplains. It was not a gradual evolution, but a sudden, synchronized explosion of urbanism. In the span of perhaps a century, a blink of an eye in historical time, the small, disparate villages of the early Harappan phase were transformed. They were torn down, leveled, and rebuilt as massive, planned metropolises. This transition marks the beginning of the mature Harappan phase. If we are looking for the myth of the Indus people, we will not find it written on papyrus scrolls. We find it here in the audacity of their engineering. In contemporary Mesopotamia, cities were organic, chaotic sprawls. They grew like tumors around the temple palaces of their kings, with winding, narrow alleys that followed the whims of property lines. The Indus cities were different. They were conceived. They were planned in their entirety before a single brick was laid. This implies a powerful, overarching ideology, a shared myth that valued order above all else. To build Mohenjo-Daro, someone had to have the authority or the religious mandate to tell thousands of people where to live, how to build, and which direction their doors must face. The city was not just a habitat, it was a machine for living, designed according to a geometry of the gods. The most striking feature of the Indus cities is the grid system. Major avenues ran strictly north-south and east-west. In Mohenjo-Daro, the main street was 45 feet wide, broad enough for 2 ox carts to pass comfortably, or perhaps for a ceremonial procession. This orientation was not accidental. It suggests a deep astronomical awareness. By aligning their streets with the cardinal directions, the Indus builders were aligning their microcosmos with the macrocosmos. The North Star, Thubin, at that time, likely held a place of reverence in their mythology as the fixed point around which the heavens turned. This adherence to the grid reflects a mythos of law. In many ancient cultures, the cardinal directions are associated with specific deities or winds. By locking their city into this grid, the Indus people were perhaps invoking a protective charm, ensuring that the wind swept through the streets to act as a natural air conditioning system, but also ensuring that their society remained straight and true. Deviating from the grid, encroaching on the public street, was likely seen not just as a civic violation, but as a moral transgression against the order of the universe. Almost every major Indus city, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, follows a binary layout. To the west, sitting on a high, man-made platform of mud brick, stands the citadel or upper town. To the east, spread out over a larger area, lies the lower town. This division is the physical manifestation of a social or religious hierarchy. The citadel was fortified, usually surrounded by massive walls and watchtowers. However, unlike the castles of medieval Europe, these walls may not have been purely for military defense. There is little evidence of siege warfare or weapon caches. Instead, the walls may have served a dual purpose: flood protection and ritual separation. The citadel was the domain of the elite, not necessarily a king, but perhaps a priesthood or a merchant oligarchy. It contained the public structures, great halls, granaries or warehouses, and ritual baths. The myth here is one of separation and stewardship. The elites on the high mound were the guardians of the city's ideology, literally elevated above the common populace, looking down to ensure the order was maintained. Yet the lower town was no slum. It was a thriving, organized sector where the artisans, traders, and common people lived. Even here, the order held. There was no stark poverty visible in the archaeological record. Even the smaller houses in the lower town had access to the drainage system. This suggests a myth of inclusivity, a society where the benefits of civilization were distributed relatively evenly, unlike the stark inequality of pharaonic Egypt. In 1927, archaeologists at Mohenjo-Daro unearthed a small, broken statue that would become the face of the civilization. It is a steatite bust of a bearded man, wearing a fillet around his head and a robe draped over one shoulder. Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the ASI, dubbed him the Priest King. This title was borrowed from Mesopotamian history, where the ruler was often the high priest of the city god. But does this title fit the Indus reality? Let us analyze the myth woven into this stone. The figure's eyes are half closed, gazing at the tip of his nose in a posture of meditation or yoga, a practice that would later become central to Hinduism and Buddhism. This suggests that spiritual introspection was a valued trait in leadership. His robe is decorated with a trefoil pattern, 3-lobe circles. In passing, this looks like a floral design. However, in the ancient world, the trefoil often had celestial significance, representing the sun, the stars, or the 3 realms of existence: earth, atmosphere, sky. The red pigment found inside these trefoils suggests they were once brightly colored. Is this a king? Probably not in the sense of a despot. There are no colossal statues of this man, no inscriptions proclaiming his conquests. He is small, only 17.5 centimeters high. Modern historians suggest he might be a clan elder or an ancestor figure. However, his existence confirms that the Indus society had a concept of formal, dignified authority. The myth he represents is one of sacred authority, power derived not from muscle, but from ritual purity and connection to the divine. If the citadel was the head of the city, the great bath at Mohenjo-Daro was its soul. This is the earliest public water tank in the ancient world. But do not mistake it for a swimming pool. It was a temple. In most ancient civilizations, the center of the city was a temple to a god, the ziggurat of Marduk, the temple of Are. In the Indus Valley, the center of the citadel was a pool of water. The structure is an engineering marvel. The floor was made of sawed bricks set on edge in gypsum mortar with a layer of bitumen, natural tar, sealer to make it watertight. It had flights of steps leading down into the water from the north and south. The existence of the Great Bath forces us to reconstruct a myth of purity. It suggests that the Indus religion did not focus on the worship of a cult statue in a dark room, but on ablution. Water was the medium through which the human connected with the divine. We can imagine the priests or elites descending into these waters to purify themselves before conducting public business or rituals. This practice of ritual bathing echoes loudly through the corridors of Indian history, visible today in the ritual bath of Hindu pilgrims in the Ganges. The Great Bath is the physical origin of the idea that water washes away not just dirt, but spiritual pollution. The most terrifyingly impressive aspect of the Indus Valley Civilization is not its art, but its weights and measures. From the borders of Afghanistan to the coasts of Gujarat, an area larger than modern Pakistan, archaeologists have found cubical weights made of chert. They are identical. The weights follow a binary system, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. for smaller denominations and a decimal system for larger ones. The base unit, ratio 16, weighs 13.63 grams. Consider the implication of this. In a world without telephones, internet, or a standing army to enforce laws, how do you ensure that a merchant in Lothal uses the exact same weight as a merchant in Harappa, 700 kilometers away? This requires a myth of standardization. The weights were not just economic tools. They were likely sacred objects. To tamper with the scales was to tamper with the cosmic order. The uniformity suggests that the Indus people believed in an objective, universal truth. There was a right way to measure the world, and adhering to it was the duty of every citizen. This obsession with ratios extended to the bricks. Whether small or large, every brick in the mature Harappan phase followed the dimension ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 respectively to thickness, width, length. This ratio is optimal for bonding bricks strength-wise, but the rigid adherence to it for 700 years smacks of religious dogma. The brick was the atom of their society, and even the atom had to be perfect. Finally, we descend from the citadel to the houses of the lower town. Here we find the myth of privacy. Indus houses were introverted. They presented blank walls to the street. There were no windows on the ground floor, only small ventilation grills high up. The entrance was often through a side lane, leading into a courtyard around which the rooms were arranged. This architecture speaks of a society that valued the sanctity of the family unit over public display. They turned inward, but the most remarkable feature of the house was the bathroom. Almost every house had a bathing area and a latrine, connected by terracotta pipes to a city-wide sewage system. The drainage system of the Indus Valley was superior to that of many 18th century European cities. The drains were covered with bricks that could be lifted for cleaning. They had soak pits and sedimentation sumps. Why spend so much energy on sewage? It goes back to the myth of purity. If the Great Bath was for ritual purity, the city drains were for civic purity. They believed that pollution, literally human waste, must be efficiently removed to maintain the sanctity of the living space. They were a civilization that battled entropy and filth with the same fervor that other cultures battled demons. As we look at the ruins, a picture emerges. The Indus Valley people did not build great pyramids to house the dead. They did not build colosseums to watch blood sport. Their greatest monuments were their drains, their granaries, and their grid-planned streets. Their myth was one of collective well-being, disciplined order, and ritual purity. They found the divine in the structure of the city itself. But while the architecture tells us how they lived, it does not tell us who they worshipped. For that, we must look smaller. We must look at the tiny, intricate masterpieces they left behind, the seals. We leave the sun-baked bricks of the massive granaries and the engineered perfection of the Great Bath to peer at something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. To understand the myth of the Indus Valley, we must look at their seals. Thousands of these tiny square tablets, mostly made of fired steatite, have been found across the civilization. Their primary function was practical, not religious. They were used in trade. A merchant would wrap a bale of goods in matting, tie it with rope, and then cover the knot with wet clay. He would then press his seal into the clay. When the goods arrived at their destination, an unbroken seal guaranteed that the contents had not been tampered with. Yet the imagery they chose for these functional objects was anything but mundane. They did not just carve their names. They carved a fantastic bestiary of creatures, gods in strange postures, and complex narrative scenes. In the absence of a decipherable scripture, these seals are the stained glass windows of the Indus Cathedral. Visual cues to a mythology we have lost the words for. The most ubiquitous image in the entire civilization, appearing on over 60% of all known seals, is a creature that does not exist. Early archaeologists called it a unicorn. It has the body of a powerful bull, but from its head, a single long, curved horn juts forward. Some historians argue this is simply an artistic convention, a clumsy attempt to show a wild ox in profile, where one horn blocks the other. However, the consistency of the image suggests something more intentional. The horn is always depicted in the same, stylized way. Furthermore, archaeologists have found terracotta figurines of this creature with a single horn, clearly modeled in 3 dimensions. This was not a mistake of perspective, it was a mythical reality. The unicorn is almost always accompanied by a strange object placed in front of it. It looks like a 2-tiered stand with a filter or a brazier on top. This is a cult object, perhaps used for burning incense or filtering a sacred ritual drink, like the Vedic soma. What is the myth of the unicorn? Its omnipresence suggests it was the supreme symbol of the state or the ruling ideology. Just as the eagle represents the United States or the lion represented the British Empire, the unicorn was the totem of the Indus identity. It may have symbolized virility, power, and a unique, perhaps divinely ordained, status that separated the Indus people from their neighbors. If the unicorn is the political symbol, another seal gives us a terrifying glimpse into their theology. Discovered at Mohenjo-Daro, Seal 420 is perhaps the most controversial and analyzed artifact of ancient India. The seal depicts a figure seated on a low dais in a yogic posture, specifically Mula Bandhana, with heels pressed together beneath the body. The figure's arms are covered in bangles, and it wears a tall, elaborate headdress made of 2 great horns with a central plant motif. The face is striking. It appears to have 3 faces looking left, right, and center, though this could be an artistic way of showing a single, all-seeing face. The figure is surrounded by animals, an elephant and a tiger to its right, a rhinoceros and a buffalo to its left. Beneath the dais are 2 antelopes or deer. Sir John Marshall stunned the world when he identified this figure as Proto-Shiva. He argued that the key attributes of the later Hindu god Shiva were present here 2,000 years early in form of Pashupati, Yogeshvara, Trimukha, Trishula. The myth here is profound. It suggests a religion centered on a powerful male deity who controls the forces of nature, encompassing both the wild, tiger, rhino, and the domestic buffalo. It implies that the practice of yoga, the spiritual discipline of controlling the body to transcend it, has roots that go back to the very dawn of civilization. While some modern scholars prefer to call him simply a horned deity or a shaman to avoid anachronism, the visual echoes of Shiva are impossible to ignore. This seal suggests that when the Indus cities fell, their gods did not die, they just changed their names. The Indus religion was not solely patriarchal. The abundance of terracotta female figurines with wide hips and elaborate hairstyles attests to a widespread mother goddess cult at the household level, focused on fertility. But on the seals, the female divine appears in more complex theological roles. One fascinating motif is the deity in the peepal tree. The sacred fig tree, or the natively called peepal tree or Ficus religiosa, is central to later Indian religions. It is the tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment. In the Indus seals, we see the origin of this reverence. A horned deity is shown standing inside the stylized arch of a peepal tree. Before the tree, a figure kneels in supplication, often accompanied by a sacrificial goat. Behind the kneeling figure stands a row of 7 human figures, perhaps priestesses or minor deities. This captures a myth of sacred ecology. The divine was not just in the sky, it was immanent in nature, specifically in the life-giving power of trees. The 7 figures may be the precursors to the Saptamatrikas, or 7 mothers of later Hindu mythology, suggesting a complex pantheon of female deities related to nature and fate. We also find seals depicting a figure struggling with 2 tigers, holding them apart with bare hands. Sometimes this figure is male, echoing the Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh, but sometimes the figure has breasts. A female master of animals suggests a powerful, combative goddess archetype, perhaps a distant ancestor to the lion-riding Durga, the warrior goddess who protects the Dharma. As we move further, the myth of the Indus Valley becomes richer and stranger. It was not a monolithic religion. It was a complex tapestry of beliefs that included totemism, shamanism or yoga, animism, and fertility cults. These seals were not just stamps, they were miniature prayers. They carried the protective power of the gods along the trade routes. And trade they did. The Indus people were the great maritime masters of the Bronze Age. If the Indus Valley was a civilization defined by order and ritual purity, it was sustained by an economy built on trade. Unlike contemporary cultures that often used conquest to acquire resources, the Indus people built their prosperity through sophisticated logistics and far-reaching commercial networks. The myth of the Indus Valley was not contained by its borders. It was exported across the Arabian Sea. The Indus Valley was a geological paradox, rich in agricultural land and clay, but poor in metals, precious stones, and even timber in some regions. To build their perfect cities, they needed tin for bronze, copper for tools, carnelian for jewelry, and steatite for their seals. They got these resources from as far away as Central Asia, the Deccan Plateau, and most significantly Mesopotamia. The evidence of this vast network is visible in the raw materials themselves, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan found in Mohenjo-Daro, and conversely, distinctively Indus seals and pottery found in the ruins of Sumerian cities. This link was so vital that the Mesopotamians named Indus Valley, Meluha, a name that echoes through ancient history, in the clay cuneiform tablets of Sumer. Dating back to 2500 BC, the scribes meticulously recorded the goods arriving by sea from 3 eastern lands: Dilmun, likely Bahrain; Magan, likely Oman; and Meluha. Meluha was always described as the furthest and most exotic. Sargon of Akkad proudly boasted that the ships of Meluha docked at his imperial port. The records describe the ships coming from Meluha as carrying copper and gold, carnelian, lapis lazuli, timber, and exotic animals such as peacocks, monkeys, and perhaps even the famed tiger. The Sumerian perception of Meluha forms a powerful external myth about the Indus Valley. They saw it as a land of unimaginable wealth, skilled artisans, and powerful maritime culture. The phrase "land of the black masts" suggests the ships were large, ocean-going vessels built for long voyages, a testament to the sophistication of the Indus shipbuilding tradition. Crucially, the Sumerians found the Indus people's weights and measures so reliable that they tried to copy the characteristic cubical chert weights. reinforcing the Indus myth of standardization even in foreign markets. To facilitate this trade, the Indus people established ports on the Arabian seacoast. The most famous example is Latal in the modern Indian state of Gujarat, which functioned as a major trading hub. The centerpiece of Latal is a massive, trapezoidal brick basin, over 200 meters long. Archaeologists originally identified this as the world's first known dockyard, capable of servicing vessels of considerable size. This structure is another crowning achievement of Indus engineering and reinforces their myth of mastery over water. While some contemporary scholars argue it may have been a large irrigation tank or a reservoir due to the absence of modern sluice gates, its proximity to the coast, its specific alignment, and the evidence of seagoing anchors and carousels found nearby strongly suggest a major naval function. Latal was not just a port, it was a manufacturing powerhouse. Excavations have revealed bead-making workshops, including tools and unfinished stones, which explain why carnelian beads from Meluha are so prized in Sumer. The sheer volume of standardized products suggests a high degree of centralized production, driven by the demands of international trade. The movement of people and ideas is best traced through the artifacts that moved with them. In Mesopotamia, distinctive circular Gulf seals and square Indus seals have been found in the administrative centers of Ur and Kish. These seals typically feature the Indus script and their hallmark unicorn. This proves that Indus merchants or their authorized representatives were physically present in Mesopotamian cities, managing their own trade operations. They were not passive suppliers. They were active, respected players in the global economy. On the other hand, while Indus seals are common in Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamian seals are rare in the Indus Valley. This suggests a trade imbalance, where the Indus was the primary exporter of finished goods and raw materials, demanding only raw bullion or less traceable commodities in return. The seals represent a powerful cultural exchange. The unicorn and the people tree were seen by the Sumerians, introducing a slice of the Indus mythos into their worldview. Conversely, the occasional presence of a Mesopotamian cylinder seal in the Indus region shows that foreign contacts were not just commercial, but also, perhaps, diplomatic or marital. The importance of water and trade leads us back to the core of the Indus myth, the absence of monumental, centralized temples dedicated to a single, overpowering deity. Unlike the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, which dominated the skyline and were the physical, economic, and political heart of the city, there are no religious superstructures in Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa. This reinforces the idea that the Indus religion was immanent, present in the rituals of daily life, rather than transcendent, housed in the heavens. The ritual life of the Indus people, as reconstructed from the ruins, seems to have revolved around purity, fertility, and ecology. The lack of monumental religious architecture implies a myth of shared piety. The religious authority was perhaps dispersed, held by ritual specialists, female elders, or merchant guilds, rather than concentrated in the hands of a single priest-king. This religious decentralization might be key to explaining the vast social stability and political uniformity that lasted for 7 centuries. Their faith was portable, adaptable, and could travel with a merchant ship. By 2300 BC, the Indus Valley Civilization was at its zenith. It was the hub of an international network, trading copper from Magan for carnelian and ivory from Meluha, and providing the raw wealth that fueled the imperial ambitions of Akkad. Their success was rooted in their core myth: order ensures prosperity. Their standardized measurements ensured trust in commerce. Their elaborate water systems ensured health. Their focus on the city structure as a cosmological map ensured civic peace. But history is cyclical, and nothing lasts forever. As we look at the immense prosperity generated by this trade, a shadow begins to fall. The river systems that gave them life were changing, and the great cities began to enter a phase of slow, undeniable decline. By 1900 BCE, the great myth of eternal order that defined the Indus Valley Civilization began to fail. The meticulously planned cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Calabangan, entered a period of catastrophic decline. The once perfectly aligned streets became littered with debris. The legendary drainage systems clogged up. New, shoddily built houses encroached upon the main avenues. The very structure of the city, which was the physical embodiment of their religious and social order, started to disintegrate. Unlike the spectacular, single-event destructions often depicted in mythology, like the fall of Troy, the Indus Valley Civilization did not end with a bang. It ended with a slow, agonizing, drawn-out whimper. Yet, for decades, the historical narrative was dominated by a different, dramatic, and ultimately flawed theory: the myth of the Aryan invasion. This is the narrative we must first confront to understand the true cause of their disappearance. The most popular, dramatic, and enduring myth about the collapse was championed by the renowned British archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler in the mid-20th century. Wheeler argued that the Indus civilization was destroyed by foreign invaders, the Indo-Aryan tribes whose religious texts, the Vedas, were composed roughly around the time of the Indus Valley Civilization decline. Wheeler famously used a line from the Rig Veda, in which the war god Indra is lauded as Purandara, the destroyer of forts or cities, to construct his theory. He pointed to archaeological evidence at Mohenjo-Daro, a dozen or so skeletons found scattered haphazardly in the streets, suggesting they were the victims of a brutal and sudden massacre. To Wheeler, Indra stands accused of the destruction of the great cities. This theory neatly explained the shift from a sophisticated urban culture of the Indus Valley to a more pastoral early Vedic period, and it served the prevailing historical framework that all progress in South Asia must have come from outside. Modern and purely historical and archaeological investigation has thoroughly dismantled the Aryan invasion theory as a cause of collapse. Excavations reveal virtually no military hardware, armor, or weapons suggesting a large invading force. The Indus cities show no evidence of a siege or mass destruction layers by fire or battle. Forensic analysis of the scattered skeletons shows that the deaths were spread over centuries, not a single event. Some skeletons show evidence of cuts or blunt force, but none are consistent with battlefield combat. Many historians now believe the deaths were likely due to street crime or disease, not war. The mature Harappan phase was already in decline long before the Indo-Aryan migrations, which is now mostly viewed as a slow migration, not an invasion, would have gained critical mass in the region. The myth of the invasion was a dramatic, simple narrative, but the true cause of the Indus decline was far more complex and terrifyingly relevant to the modern world. The consensus among modern historians, paleoclimatologists, and archaeologists points to environmental catastrophe as the primary driver of the Indus collapse, a devastating, centuries-long ecological crisis. The civilization was built on the bounty of the great river systems, particularly the Indus and the Gagarhakra, or the Saraswati. Geological studies reveal two catastrophic environmental shifts beginning around 2000 BC, tectonic movements and monsoon failure. Tectonic movements altered the landscape of the Punjab. The major feeder rivers that once supplied the Gagarhakra, the Sutlej and the Yamuna, began to migrate eastward, eventually joining the Indus and the Ganges systems, respectively. This starved the Gagarhakra, causing it to dry up and leaving hundreds of settlements along its banks utterly desolate. Cores taken from the Arabian Sea and cave stalagmites across India show a prolonged, intense drying period associated with a major shift in the South Asian summer monsoon patterns. This was a mega drought. The combination of a migrating river and a failing monsoon was a death blow to a civilization dependent on surplus agriculture. The myth of the fertile land shattered. The environmental collapse created an immediate demographic shift. People could not sustain themselves in the dying core regions of Sindh and Punjab. They began a massive eastern migration toward the more reliable rain-fed areas of Gujarat and the Ganges-Yamuna region. As the population dispersed, the central political and economic authority disappeared. The strict 1 to 2 to 4 brick ratio vanished. The standardized chert weights disappeared, replaced by localized variable systems. The city drains were no longer maintained. This was the collapse of the standardization. In the last layers of Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists find evidence of people living in tiny, ramshackle structures built on top of the Great Walls, scavenging bricks from the abandoned ceremonial buildings. Public life ceased. The Great Bath was filled in and built upon. The great Indus culture fragmented into regional styles known as the late Harappan culture in Punjab and the Jorwe culture in the Deccan. This marks the end of the centralized, unified Indus identity. The great cities were not conquered, they were abandoned. The people did not disappear, they simply traded their identity as urban Harappans for rural regionalists, carrying their cultural DNA with them. Despite the collapse of the urban centers, the most remarkable part of the Indus story is its continuity. The Indus Valley Civilization did not truly die. It was the foundation upon which later Indian civilization was built. The great cities vanished, but the great mythos endured. The horned, yogic figure of the Pashupati seal survived and merged with the Vedic god Rudra to become Shiva, the great ascetic and ultimate divine force of Hinduism. The ubiquitous terracotta figurines ensured the survival of the concept of the female divine, which flowered into the cult of Shakti, Durga, and the Saptamatrikas. The obsession with bathing, evident in the Great Bath and the house drains, survived as the central concept of ritual purity in Hinduism, leading to the veneration of river goddesses and the practice of puja involving water. The meditating figure confirms that the practice of yoga is an indigenous Indian tradition predating the Vedic period. The reverence for the bull, Nandi, the buffalo, and the peepal tree passed directly from the Indus seals into the Hindu pantheon and sacred ecology. While the Indus script remains undeciphered, many scholars believe the language, spoken by the Harappans, was a form of Proto-Dravidian. As the population migrated south and east, they carried this language family with them. This explains why Dravidian languages still flourish in South India today, and why linguistic traces of the ancient language are found in northern languages. The Bravi language in Balochistan is one such isolate. The skills of the Indus farmers, their high-yield wheat and barley strains, their ability to harness monsoon runoff, and their development of cotton cultivation, which the Greeks later called Sindon after the Sindh River, were passed on, ensuring agricultural continuity for the next era. The greatest myth of the Indus Valley is perhaps the fact that it was not a prehistoric civilization distinct from India's history, but its first historical phase. Its customs, its gods, and its deeply ingrained preference for order and purity became the perennial source material for the subsequent Indian experience. The Indus Valley Civilization remains a land of profound silence. We can walk their perfect streets, gaze at their horned gods, and marvel at their engineering, but we cannot hear their names. They left no epic poetry to mourn their passing, and no monuments to immortalize their kings. Yet this silence speaks volumes. It tells the story of a civilization that built its empire not on conquest, but on commerce. It tells of a society where the ultimate power was held not by a warrior king, but by the shared, deeply held ideology of order and standardization. The rise of the Indus Valley was built on the myth of mastery, the belief that through structure, engineering, and ritual purity, humanity could establish a permanent, peaceful dominion over the chaotic forces of nature and history. The great achievement of the Indus Valley is that while their civilization dissolved into dust and drought, its spirit, its mythos did not. It simply blended into the landscape, waiting to be rediscovered, not as an isolated chapter, but as the quiet, enduring source of Indian civilization itself.